afternoon. Welcome to Community and Technology, where we connect the global community with news, information, and resources to hopefully help improve your life. I'm Stu Reid, and here with my co-host, Dave Burstein. Hey, Dave.
Hello.
And today we have a very special guest with us, New York State Senator Luis Sepulveda. The senator was first elected to represent the 32nd Senate District in April of 2018. His diverse district covers large parts of the South and Central Bronx. As chair of the Senate Committee on Crimes, Crime Victims, and Corrections, the senator has been a leader in criminal justice reform, working to change the culture of distrust between the communities of color and the police, and to correct inherent racial biases in the justice system. Senator Sepulveda earned his bachelor's degree from Hofstra University and his law degree from Hofstra, Maurice A. Dean School of Law. Welcome, Senator, to Community and Technology.
Thank you for having me on the program. Look forward to being here now and in the future.
Absolutely, absolutely. If you could just share a little bit about your background, Senator, how you came to be in politics, and a little bit about your personal background.
Sure. So I was born in Brooklyn to two Puerto Rican parents. I lived in Brooklyn, lived in Queens, lived in Manhattan, lived in every borough except for Staten Island. I went to Hofstra University for undergrad. Was there from 1982 to 86. In 1991, I graduated from Hofstra Law School. Been practicing attorney since. In 1992, I moved to the Soundview Shorehaven section of the Bronx, and got involved in local activism. I was doing a housing court free workshop for residents in the district that needed help with the housing court. I was also a member of the Bronx Democratic Party. And in 2010, I first ran for the New York State Assembly in the 87th Assembly District. I lost that election to Peter Rivera, 20-year incumbent. They told me I'd be lucky if I get 10%. I wound up getting 44% of the vote. Wow. So I ran again the following year. The incumbent had then become Secretary of the State for New York, and it was an open seat, and I won against an opponent. And then I was there for 6.5 years. In April of 2018, I was fortunate enough to get elected in a special election to the 32nd district in the Bronx in the Senate, and I've been there since. If you ask me what are my passions, of course, criminal justice has always been one of them. Immigration is a big issue of mine, and technology is something that's very important to mine, issue of mine. So that's why we're doing bills like the geo warrant bills and things of that nature. Very proud to be serving in the Bronx. I have a very diverse community of Hispanics, African Americans, and South Asians. And it's a robust community. It's a poor community, if not the poorest, one of the poorest communities in the entire United States, I'd say. Graduation rates are not what they should be. They're about 20% lower than the rest of the city. It's a relatively young community, especially the West Farm section. High unemployment. COVID ravaged a good part of the district. So it's a district that, I struggle because I want economic development, but I don't want to gentrify the community because people have been there their entire lives, shouldn't be displaced by new communities. So it's a battle that we have, but I'm struggling to get healthcare improvements, education improvements, and of course, economic development in this community.
Well, you certainly know your way around New York City, that's for sure, given your background. So now, what would you say? There's so much going on, particularly with the pandemic. What would you say is the most pressing concern that you're looking at right now for citizens in your district and the Bronx in general?
Well, as an immediate snapshot, obviously it's the issue of children returning to school. That is something that has me extremely concerned because I, for one, believe that it should not be in school. It should be at home learning until we have some form of a vaccine that can alleviate some of the concerns. I know that the president, who has done a terrible job managing this crisis, has been pushing for school openings despite the fact that nearly 100,000 children have been infected with the coronavirus. The impact on them, there's still not sufficient scientific evidence to say what the president is claiming, that children get well, that they don't get sick. I mean, obviously, the intensity of their illness with COVID doesn't appear to be as great as adults, but that doesn't mean that children haven't died or children haven't gotten very ill. And it doesn't mean that children cannot infect grandma and granddad and the tios and the tias in the community. So I'm extremely concerned about it. I don't see how anyone can keep a 5 or 6-year-old in a mask and tell them you cannot social distance with your school friends. It's just not practical. And so that's right now, I think that's the biggest concern. You couple that also with the immense amount of food insecurity and poor healthcare services historically and traditionally. A lot of that based on structured racism within even the healthcare community. We're worried about what's going to happen, a second wave, or see what's going to happen in the community, because we have a lot of poverty. And when you see what's going to happen relatively quickly when the housing moratorium, eviction moratorium, is lifted, I have an extreme fear. In fact, I lose sleep at night sometimes thinking about how many people that I represent may wind up being homeless if we don't do something. The federal government can resolve this relatively easily, but under the current political climate, I'm not sure that we're going to get the funding that we want. It's interesting because New York gives more into the federal coffers than most other states. We are givers, so to speak.
Right.
And all of these states with red states with Republican governors that look down upon the state of New York, many of them, including Kentucky, which is Mitch McConnell, the Senate leader, his home state, they are the biggest recipients of New York welfare, for lack of a better term, than most other states in the union. So we give, we contribute a lot to the federal treasury, yet for some reason, people always chirping at us or nipping at our heels and want to allege somehow that New York is a burden on the United States, when the opposite is true.
Let me come in.
I'd like to go back for a minute and just talk about the school situation. I'd like to know what you're hearing from parents, and also what was the experience in the springtime when the kids had to come home. And, we heard so many kids, I work in technology, Dave works in technology. And, one of the things that I do in my other life is helping to bridge the digital divide, bringing free internet services to public and affordable housing communities. And I know that so many hundreds of thousands of folks don't have internet at home. And I'm wondering what was the experience in the springtime. The city supposedly distributed several 100,000 devices that I think had connectivity built in. I'm wondering what your experience was with your community, and what's that looking like for the fall?
The whole impact of Corona in March was something that, admittedly, very few state and local governments were prepared for. Clearly, the city, most other municipalities, never had to face a situation where they now have to rely solely on distant learning. And many of the parents of children who had these tablets didn't have money for internet. Luckily, they have built-in hotspots, but still, a good portion of these students that were in home, being homeschooled or being long-distance schooled, just weren't prepared. And the results are obvious. Many children didn't get the level of education during those months that they should have received. And I believe that that's exacerbated even more in the community that I represent because of the level of poverty. We push the city, we push Altice and any other provider to provide a free internet service to these communities. Some did, some didn't. We are now going into a larger scale where I believe now up to over 30,000 parents have selected the option of teaching the children being taught from home. The city should be a little prepared, but I'm not 100% certain that they're as prepared as they should be.
Is that 30,000 in your district, Senator, or in the Bronx, or within what community?
No, when parents were deciding, I believe that there was a change where they now like 30% of the students citywide.
Oh, 30%. I'm sorry. Okay.
Right, are selecting to go and learn from home. So, I'm not confident. I have a good working relationship with the chancellor, and I've been on them constantly. I'm not still confident that we are prepared to go back to school, certainly when school starts in a couple of weeks. We should delay it, maybe after November when we have more information. Certainly the unions, the UFT, and NYSA are vehemently opposed to starting in September. Their teachers don't want to go back to school because they don't believe that they have the sufficient safeguards built in to protect them. The average age of a school teacher is about 52 years old. Many of them are within that vulnerable group, and those that are compromised, immunocompromised, or have asthma or diabetes, they are put in a very difficult position. And there have been situations where teachers have died from infection of COVID. So, we're going to uncharted waters. And unfortunately, unlike countries like, for example, I had a conversation with someone from South Korea who told me that their children, because of SARS and obviously they had other issues in their country, but they prepare their children, and the children from a very young age are wearing face masks. And the kids become indignant when the parents don't put them on.
Wow.
If you look at the way their schools are built, they have these glass or plexiglass dividers. The children are separated 6 feet apart. I mean, it looks like if we had that here in the city, and I can be guaranteed that we're going to have the same accommodations, then I would feel a lot more comfortable about children going back to the school settings. But I have not seen that. I am not confident, and I am extremely concerned about our kids going back to school.
Okay, you're listening to WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem. And this is Community and Technology, and we're speaking with State Senator Luis Sepulveda. Dave, did you want to chime in on this issue about back to school and
yeah, let's go into the practicalities. You mentioned Altice, and obviously there's Verizon in your district. How many people have they newly hooked up, do you think?
Newly hooked up? I'm not sure Altice is the main provider in the areas that I represent. There is some Verizon, but I believe Altice is the biggest one. I don't have a record of them providing of how many families they gave free services to. I don't think it's a large number. And in fact, some of my colleagues and I are pressing either through legislative fiat or some other way that we can get guarantee that in those areas where they're needed, that they can provide free services to poor communities.
Did you see what Chicago has done for the school children with ComTech?
What has Chicago done that we're not doing?
They bought 50,000 connections wholesale.
Oh, yes.
And there's a huge difference there. It turns out, and I've been writing about broadband for 20 years, the cost to somebody like Altice or Charter to add another customer is somewhere between $6 and $8 a month, for which they charge somewhere between $40 and $70 a month, retail and wholesale. So the question is how you could manage to get a wholesale deal to connect the people who aren't connected. Comcast worked closely with Chicago. Chicago set up a nonprofit and a whole program. What can we do here in New York that are going to get more kids connected?
Well, I know that New York now has the tablets themselves are Wi-Fi eligible. They are hotspots themselves. But again, let's look beyond the city of New York. You look in rural areas that don't have access to Wi-Fi. In places like these, certainly a program like this would be something that I would certainly be interested in fleshing out to see if we can bring that kind of program into the poorest sectors of the state and the areas that don't have broadband. So maybe we're off this.
Yeah, but you're the senator from the Bronx. Talk about the Bronx and Harlem and the places that are near us. What practical things can be done in the next month or 3 months to make a difference?
If you're talking about broadband, is really getting the cable companies to provide it. Look, there are some members that are we're going to have public hearings on this issue. I know there's been a discussion with my colleagues in the Senate. So certainly we can use whatever pressure to bear on these companies to provide the free broadband to the poor communities. But look, even though I'm from the Bronx and I represent this area, the issue of broadband and lack of access to the internet is greater in those rural areas, because I've spoken with some of my colleagues that represent those areas. And to me, generally speaking, when you have this level of poverty, it's usually Black and brown communities that suffer. Black and brown poor children that aren't getting access to broadband, aren't able to get the level of education that they need. So to me, even though it's not in my district, it is happening in my district, but it is also happening in other areas where you have poverty. And to me, wherever you have poverty is a place where I'm going to step in to try to help either eradicate it or create programs that help people that are poor.
Yeah, actually, New York is very lucky in this. There's almost no places that don't have broadband, no matter how much you hear of people looking for subsidies. It turns out we have something on the order of 98% cable coverage. And we had, I don't know, how many $100 million in the last few budgets and from the feds to reach that last 2%.
But as you know, David, availability and access are not the same thing. Even though broadband might be available universally, I know in public housing, nearly half of the public housing residents, which are Black and brown folks predominantly, don't have internet at home. It's not because it's not available. You know, it's not affordable. Folks just don't have the discretionary income to buy it.
That's 100% correct. And you know, we should not be living certainly in a city of so much poverty, of so much wealth, where poor Black and brown children are not getting the same services and are not getting the same level of education as their white counterpart, but certainly their wealthy counterparts, because I believe it's more of an issue of wealth than it is solely that it's Black and brown communities. I mean, obviously there is this systemic racism in these communities that people have suffered as a result. But you're right, we don't have, there is broadband availability, but I can tell you, like a community like West Farms, that it's extremely poor. And I know households there that didn't have access, and their kids suffered during this process.
Yeah, Dave, I want to throw this question at Dave for a moment and then get your reaction, Senator. Did Chicago, the city, make that purchase from the cable companies on a wholesale basis, or was it a third party? Because I'm wondering, like, why wouldn't the Board of Ed, for instance, set aside some of the $20,000+ they spend on every student every year and spend, $600 per student on purchasing an annual internet account for every student?
Well, actually, if it's wholesale, it'd be considerably less.
Be a heck of a lot less. That's right. That's right. Dave, what was the mechanism that Chicago used? You know?
Chicago, the government led it. Board of Ed and everybody else were involved. They set up, as I recall the details, they set up a nonprofit to organize it. Strong support from the cable company. Comcast has a long-standing record of doing more than, for example, Verizon. Verizon in West Farms and everywhere else in the city was committed to bringing fiber to the home back in 2008. In fact, I was responsible for an error in the New York Times because I said that Verizon commitment was clear and they were going to deliver, and it made it into the Times. How much fiber is there in the district, Senator?
I don't, certainly I have family who live there, and Verizon is not a big player in that area. I don't know how much there is, but I can tell you that it doesn't have certainly the market share that they should have, and certainly they're not providing free services to people in the community.
and they're not providing anything more than 15-year-old DSL.
Hey, Dave, your level is kind of low. Dave, can you get closer to your mic? I can hear you.
Am I a little bit better now?
That's
Much better.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Verizon is my bugaboo on some of this.
Mhm.
They're one of the wealthiest corporations in the world. They make literally $20 billion on average per year, and they haven't succeeded. To get the franchise for TV in New York, they committed to connecting everybody. New York City has been in court with them for 6 years, and nothing has happened. But
Mhm.
when I get a politician on the other end of the conversation, I say, how do we get them off their butt, and how do we get the service? And it turns out that Verizon nationally has done terribly during the pandemic. They actually have fewer connections now than they had in January.
Yeah,
And
and they're not good neighbors. They're not good community neighbors. I mean, that's been our experience, certainly mine in 10 years. We've asked them to participate in community type events to assist some of our schools. I have, again, I'll go back to West Farms, where you have a school that was built in the 1930s, has furniture from the 1940s.
Mm.
And most of the children there rely on food, breakfast and lunch, in order to get decent meals throughout the day. These kids are the ones that are in need of this service, and Verizon has not stepped up to the plate. Certainly in our deliberations in the Senate, in my office, never once has Verizon reached out and say, how can we help your community? So it's distressing. And I think with some of the licenses that they need and some of the permissions that they need, the governor can certainly be more effective at compelling him to do certain things. We shall see. I haven't seen that yet from the governor, but there's no reason why Verizon should not be compelled to be a better neighbor.
I'd be interested, Senator, have you seen a change, speaking of cooperation and support from the corporations, have you seen any marked difference in LT since the ownership changed from Cablevision and the Dolan family to the French-owned company LT? Have you seen any difference in community relations?
Nothing appreciable.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And they have an office in my district. But again, generally speaking, the cable companies, generally speaking, are not. They don't really focus on local communities where they have, for example, they have an office, a big facility in Soundview in the Bronx, which is in my district,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't go out of their way to work with the community. They usually work with federal representatives, and when they come to this state, is because they need probably some sort of permission from the legislature.
Yeah.
But the cable companies, little to be desired about them. And they can make an appreciable difference.
Yeah, my history goes way back to the 80s when they were first letting out, New York City was first letting out the franchises in the outer boroughs. Mm-hmm. Manhattan at the time was the only borough with cable. And Cablevision in particular redlined the Bronx, redlined Brooklyn.
Sure.
So they were going to the wealthy, well-to-do, upper-income white areas first, save the poor Black and brown communities to last. My group fought with the city to get a franchise to service the poor communities. And that's a whole long story. But yeah, what we learned
But it's part of their history.
Yeah, the cable companies really don't give a darn about the people. No, and they didn't even recognize what voracious consumers we were of media. Black and brown folks, we consume a lot more media than other folks and spend a lot more money on home entertainment than the average consumer. But, that was 30, 40 years ago. They didn't recognize, and they still don't give a darn about it today. So, I'm just kind of blowing my horn a little bit in terms of some of the approach that we have done, and Dave has helped. We've been working with resident associations, particularly public housing resident associations, partnering with them to provide free internet access, working with them and kind of empowering them to own and control their own technology. And we've got a couple of things, a request in front of the city right now, trying to get some additional funding to really expand that out. But it's a model, community network model, is what
Yes.
it is. And it's something that I believe in. And, I think it's a way for us as folks on the ground to take control of the technology and service ourselves rather than waiting for these big multinational corporations to give us a hand up.
I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah.
Well,
So,
after the
Dave, let me just give a plug. We're at the bottom of the hour. Listen to WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem. This is Community and Technology, Stu and Dave, and we're talking with New York State Senator Luis Sepulveda. Dave, you wanted to ask the senator a question?
may I ask him the hard stuff?
You haven't already?
Well, I've been pointing at it, but I'm constantly thinking about things that will make a difference. What do you think would happen if you as a state senator said, New York City should come in, whether or not they hire Stu to do it, and put wireless in all the public housing in your district?
Closer to your mic, Dave.
Yep.
And wireless keeps getting better and better.
Hey, Dave, we're losing your audio. We can't hear you.
So, question. What would happen, Senator, if you came out publicly and said, to heck with these folks you're saying aren't delivering for the community, at least for the public housing, New York City should go in and put in a wireless system, which is incredibly cheap to do with today's technology. How would they respond to you?
Well, I think the mayor would be a little bit taken back by it. I think most of my colleagues would support that, especially those that represent poor Black and brown communities, colleagues that have NYCHA developments in their senatorial district. I think it would be, as we're talking now, you're giving me some very good ideas. So, something that I'm going to take back to the leadership and certainly to the mayor.
Mm-hmm. And just so you know, Senator, and I think you know, Dave, EDC and the mayor has proposed a $150 million program to help bring broadband to low-income, underserved, and particular public housing communities. I'm not really confident that they're going to make that program happen like it should. We're trying to get involved in it. My group working with public housing, particularly in Harlem, trying to get involved in it. I would ask that maybe you keep an eye on that and maybe help move that along and advocate on behalf of some of the resident groups. One of the things that we find is that, the city bureaucrats come in with their paternalistic solutions. Oh, they know what's best. They know what the people need. Here's the solution. They don't involve the people in asking the people what they need, how they want to do it, or any of that.
Right, that's right.
We've been working from the ground up, working with the residents. What do you want? How do you want to see it? And offering them, partnering with them so they can actually control it and operate it. We've been doing this in Harlem for a while. We did some stuff in the Bronx back in the 90s and early 2000s at Melrose houses and Mont Haven houses, working with resident associations. So we know that the residents are a lot more sophisticated than the bureaucrats give them credit for.
Yes, and I agree with you more.
And if we were able to put technology in their hands and fund them directly, as opposed to trying to get the big companies to do something, as opposed to bringing outside solutions that the bureaucrats decide, oh, this is in the best interest. Give the money to the residents and let them figure out how to do it. That's what my group has been advocating for and working with resident groups to try and make happen. So I would ask for you to keep an eye on some of that, and maybe I'll share all.
Oh yeah, sure. I mean,
some of the work that we're
essentially
doing.
You're thinking out of the box, and that's a great concept.
Yeah,
I really like that. I never really thought about that. That sounds something that I'd like to flesh out more.
Yeah, sure.
Well, let me come in here because it's not thinking out of the box. It's just looking outside of New York. For example, a state legislator in Washington made just that proposal. Said maybe they should go ahead and just build their own because they weren't being taken care of. And the first thing that happened is he said he was swamped by all the lobbyists who wanted to find a way to help keep them in the system and not do anything like this. Going way back, the way that North Carolina had some of the best broadband coverage in the country in the early days. Why? Burstein, who you may know in politics, he ran for senator and so on, led a commission in North Carolina that said, we want broadband. We want all the companies to do it. But where they don't do it, the state has to do something. And suddenly the companies had been saying they couldn't deliver broadband to most of the state, were building like crazy. So that these aren't really out of the box. These are things that I'm watching in many other places. And they're happening and they're working.
Well, I think, I guess let me qualify that by saying by New York standards, they're thinking out of the box.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I was on a listening call with some folks from New York State. The governor has established a new commission to look at broadband and how to get into some of the areas,
Yes.
both urban and rural, that you were talking about, Senator. And there were some officials, including some mayors from some of the upstate municipalities, that were saying a lot of what we're saying. One, don't give the money to the big guys, because you can try and incentivize them to bring service to the unconnected and underserved, but they work very hard to circumvent those requirements and those rules. And they and I and others on the call were advocating for, what I just said. Let's get around and bring some of that funding directly into the community and municipal networks and community networks that folks in the locality control. So that's that's something I think we should keep an eye on.
Absolutely.
And Senator, I'd like for a minute, as the clock is ticking, to talk a little bit about the geofence warrants. And I know, Senator, you and John Lewis and some others introduced some legislation back in April in the New York State Senate about that. Can you talk a little bit about what that is to some of our viewers and listeners that might not know what a geofence warrant even is? What is that?
Absolutely. I think certainly since 9/11, many citizens in this country are not aware of how much of their personal privacy they've given up under federal law, and how the federal government can see a lot of your privacy, can see a lot of your information, can see where you are in ways that we can imagine. So with geo warrants, is basically they'll ask, for example, Google, if a particular incident occurred, a crime occurred, they will ask Google to essentially throw out a net for everyone in a particular area. That's the first part. And then after that,
and by everyone, you mean every device, any device in that area, right?
Any device that was in a particular, let's say there was some sort of protest, like Black Lives Matters protest, they will request that Google will send out a net telling us all the devices that were within that region. Then what will happen is they will start, when they pinpoint what they're looking for, they will start looking into access into emails that were sent in that area, other apps that were used, to certainly try to narrow down within, let's say, a certain distance as to where they think the incident may have occurred, let's say. And then the third is, once they've narrowed down, the third process is try to focus on particular individuals. The problem is that with the geo warrants, the locations are only about 68% accurate. So you're going to throw out a net, and you're going to catch a lot of people that have committed absolutely no crime, that are private citizens that are behaving the way they should behave, and yet they will be subject to this search by law enforcement. The step 2 and 3 of the process is really up to the discretion of police officers. And so I'm never comfortable when you leave law enforcement that much discretion. And I think more critically is that when you have these types of enforcement mechanisms, they're usually implemented, instituted in poor Black and brown communities. And I know, just like most criminal justice issues in this country, it will be used primarily against Black and brown communities. And when you have that level of almost inherent discrimination with law enforcement, I'm never comfortable with that. And so we have to put in some safeguards. When you want to apply for a warrant, you have to be very specific. There has to be what they call suppression motions in the event that you do target someone who's not part of what they believe was the actual crime, that their level of information is protected and subject to suppression warrants, so that people can't get access to this unless these safeguards are in place. It's a whole new world, and many times when you have this kind of technology, it's abused by law enforcement. And until we have the safeguards built in through legislative fiat, I think that we should keep a close eye on them and certainly monitor them as closely as possible. Because when this country was created, we were concerned about these sorts of devices, although we didn't have electronic devices, but we were concerned about King George and his soldiers invading our privacy, monitoring what we were doing. And this is essentially a new King George at a larger scale, in a way that it's sometimes difficult for the average individual to figure out that their privacy rights were violated by our local or federal law enforcement.
Mm-hmm. If I'm not correct, this is the Fourth Amendment, or unreasonable search and seizure that you're talking about. That's
correct.
King George and just stopping and picking up people and searching because they wanted to.
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the Patriot Act, you can see there, how much we've given up in the name of security, how much our privacy we've given up. And I think geo warrants are a major threat to the issue of the right to privacy.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Dave.
No, you guys know more about this one than I do. I have not studied geofenced warrants. Know that all the companies, Google, but also even TikTok, are being swamped with requests from the authorities.
That's correct.
Now become almost routine that if they're looking for somebody, or they're looking for who committed a crime, they just go to Google and say, who the heck was there? And they take advantage of that kind of thing.
And one of the things that I'm trying to bring to the surface is the fact that Google, by and large, is complying with these requests. And the consumer has to know this. And I think if you put pressure on Google and all of these apps, that individuals will not use their apps or acquire their apps because of the privacy rights, the potential for privacy right invasion, that perhaps it'll force Google to do things a little differently. The average person that gets on TikTok or does a Google search, they don't know the ability that law enforcement has to track them down because they're doing some sort of Google search or because they're using Facebook or whatever apps are available to locate where the individuals are.
Yeah, one of the things that I read in my little research was that as soon as you enable your location history application within the device, which a lot of folks do because it helps enable other things that they want to do. Once you enable that, then Google or whomever has your history. And right now, there's little to no legislation. I know there's a big case in Virginia that's being litigated, or at least it was recently. I don't know if it's been adjudicated yet, where they're pushing up on the Fourth Amendment relative to the geofence warrants. Tell us about your bill. What does your proposed bill? How does it help regulate this?
Well, it essentially limits the information that the way that the law enforcement can get the information. What we're saying is that you can't throw out a net and say, well, let's see all these individuals are within an incident. What we're saying is that you have to be more precise, and you have to, if you get information, somebody who may have been caught up information that may be criminal in nature, then of someone who's not the target of the investigation, that there'll be some ability for someone who gets caught and snarled in that target, there'll be the ability for them to file a suppression motion to suppress whatever evidence they acquired as a result of these jail warrants. So what we're trying to do, myself, Selma Myrie from Brooklyn, and Jamal Bailey, we're sort of like the three horsemen of privacy rights and criminal justice reform. We are trying to do everything to rein in the ability of local police to be able to access willy-nilly geo warrants and access the kind of information that they can get, to limit it so that you can have a mechanism for law enforcement, crime fighting, but not at the expense of the privacy of us as citizens of this country.
Yeah. One of the things that I read, that there are actually brokers and data headhunters, if you will, that are out looking for data, and that some of the companies, a piece that Vice wrote said that T-Mobile, Sprint, and AT&T are actually selling location-related data to these bounty hunters and data brokers.
Oh, it's a $1 billion industry right now. It certainly is.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah. So that's something that we, as part of what we've discussed in our deliberations, I know we've had discussions about that as well. How do we limit these brokers, so to speak, and the ability of the companies to sell the data to these brokers?
Yes, that's very important work that you're doing. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It sounds, you wound up in the Wall Street Journal internationally because of this bill. Congress, and I have an old roommate who was in the middle of this one, brought in the tech leaders, the CEOs of the company, got a lot of publicity. I don't know what's going to come out of it, other than that everybody knows they really are busting antitrust rules right and left. That became pretty clear. Is it a place for a state legislator to jump into the technology fights and make a difference? Is that something that you'd be tempted to do? Did you get good response?
Well, I mean, certainly on the state level, because remember that law enforcement in this country is essentially bifurcated. You have federal law enforcement, you have state police, city police. Well, what we can do at the state level, where when it involves criminal matters, at the state level, we can limit the information that is acquired through these geo warrants. At the federal level, it would be more difficult. And I certainly believe under the current climate, the current occupant of the White House has no problems with giving away our privacy rights. I don't think we'll be able to effectuate any change right now, but at the state level,
but how did it play for you to get noticed in these issues beyond New York State?
Well, back in 2013 or 14, I had a metadata bill, also along the lines of limiting the metadata information that people receive. I mean, I had this 7-8 years ago. So, in some circles, I've sort of like developed a relationship as being a guy who's in tune with technology vis-a-vis its use by law enforcement and the issue of privacy rights. So I believe, I've done other interviews to discuss this matter, and I think the Wall Street Journal's piece just tends to let most people know that this is an area that's very important to me, and that I'm going to continue to see what I can do to limit the government's ability to interfere in your privacy.
Senator, what would be your observations around what we're talking about now, the geofence warrants and the technology surveillance capabilities vis-a-vis COVID-19 and the contact tracing that folks are trying to implement? Is there a potential privacy risk there, as you see it?
Oh, I mean, wherever you have this sort of data, be it for benevolent reasons or malevolent reasons. Whenever you have this sort of technology, you can use it for, potentially for tracing. I don't know how, I would believe that if you start using for this, some people are concerned about giving information when it comes to tracing as it is, right? Mm-hmm. There's some, in some places, maybe 60% of individuals that were infected gave information about where they were, and, it was about 60%. Certainly this can help. But the question is, do we want to give up, again, our privacy rights? You could have someone who went into a particular area where they didn't want a spouse to find out, or, a relative that went into a particular area, has a certain lifestyle that they don't want a family member or a friend to find out. All this stuff can happen during this crisis. And with the geo warrants, you can access where individuals were. So it's sort of like a double-edged sword, because I know it could be effective at helping with tracing. But again, we have to weigh whether we want to continue to give away our privacy rights when there are less intrusive measures to get the same information.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, we're kind of winding down to the end of our hour here. Is there anything that you'd like to share, Senator, about your work or what's going on in the city that we haven't touched on yet?
Well, I mean, a couple of issues. One is that because of the potential $13 to $16 billion budget deficit that we have in the state, we're going to suffer severe cuts. At the city level, the mayor's talking about really relieving about 22,000 municipal employees of their duties because they can't afford to keep them on payroll. So you're seeing a cut in services that are critical, especially in poor communities. You're seeing that an equal quality of healthcare in Black and brown and poor communities is being accentuated by this crisis. And unless we do more in that area to create better healthcare systems in our communities, you're going to see some of that. What I'm seeing now is in some locations, people just not wearing masks. I take mass transportation and seeing people on the train or a subway without a mask. Seeing 18, 19-year-olds playing basketball on the court on top of each other, doing what happens in basketball courts. So I'm concerned that because of the level of success we've had, that people are slacking off, and that will lead to more problems. It'll lead to a wave, and that will certainly, it's not the kind of behavior that we should be engaging in right now. We should continue to be vigilant, because if not, we may wind up where we were before, or wind up like Broward and Dade County in Florida. I'm concerned about that. People should continue to take all the safety measures that are necessary to contract the spread of the coronavirus. But in several circles that I've been in recently, I'm not seeing that. So I just want to, again, scream from the bleachers, telling people, please wear the face mask, wash your hands, keep social distance, because that's the only way that we're going to get out of this crisis.
Dave, any final comments or questions for the senator before we close out?
Well, I want to thank the senator that he's encouraging me to think again about the possibility of New York doing something more than it is now. And I hope you find a way to do it.
Well, thank you. And I hope to speak with you in the future about some of these concepts you talk about, especially Chicago, see what I can do.
Okay.
I'll give you all the data.
Right.
Thank you,
gentlemen.
This has been Community and Technology. We've been speaking with State Senator Luis Sepulveda. Thank you so much, Senator, for joining us.
Thank you, sir. You guys stay safe.
Okay, thank you. Okay.